In this video, I want to talk about the topic of equality, specifically as it relates to the Constitution and our legislative body, the House and the Senate. If you recall from the Constitutional Convention back in 1787, one of the most heated debates they had was how this new legislative body was going to be represented or comprised. So what you had was large states wanting to do what? They wanted to make sure it was based on their numbers, population, so they would get more voice. The smaller states were concerned because if they unfortunately didn't have a lot of people living in their state or colony at the time, they were going to be less represented. And they wanted it based on, similar to the Articles of Confederation, which was that each state essentially was on equal footing regardless of size. This debate was so heated that it was actually risking the breakdown of the entire Constitutional Convention. But they were able to reach a compromise, and the word for that is the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise is simply this. They formed a bicameral or a two-branch chamber, which you had a Senate on one hand, which was going to equally represent states, 2 senators per state, and on the other hand, you had the House of Representatives, which was going to apportion representatives based on population. And so those two bodies, those two chambers, would work together to create legislation and so forth. So equality, all the way back to the beginning of our country, was enshrined in the Constitution. So I'm going to set the Senate aside because this particular organization that I'm a part of, apportionment.us, and this lawsuit I mentioned, doesn't deal with the Senate at all. It's strictly the House of Representatives. But it was clear from the Constitutional Convention and in the years to follow that the representation in the House was going to be based on population. And in fact, so much so that they enshrined a census to be taken every 10 years to make sure that the apportionment of the House would be readjusted according to population, according to people, the country growing as well as population shifting to other states and so forth. So let's fast forward from 1787 up to the early 60s. And I just want to reference there were two landmark Supreme Court cases, one called Baker v. Carr in 1962, which dealt with the state of Tennessee legislature, that for 60 years they did not reapportion their state legislators. And it wasn't until the early 60s that this lawsuit came into being, which essentially said to Tennessee, hey, look, you have to have an apportionment and a legislative representation that's reflective of population. And they hadn't changed that in 60 years, if you can believe that. Then you have Westbury v. Sanders, which is really, this dealt with state legislatures. Westbury Sanders dealt with actual federal congressional apportionment in the state of Georgia. Now, mind you, what happened in this lawsuit is that you had certain congressional districts that comprised the House of Representatives, the 435 number, in the state of Georgia. You had one district that had an excess of 800,000 people comprising one district. And then you had another district that was only 1/3 as large. That was the extremities that you dealt with in this particular state of Georgia at the time this lawsuit came into being. And the Supreme Court rightly said, how can you continue such an unequal representation with voters across the country? And here is one of the key quotes from that particular Supreme Court case from Westbury Sanders. The court concluded this: we hold that construed in its historical context, the command of Article 1, Section 2, that representatives be chosen by the people of the several states from the Constitution, means that as nearly as is practicable, or feasible is another way to say practicable, one man's vote in a congressional election is to be worth as much as another's. So it's simply saying that no matter where you live in the state of Georgia, if you're a voter in County A and you're a voter in County B, then you ought to have the same representation, the same proportional representation in Congress. And in fact, Westbury made another statement that said that the Constitution essentially demands equal representation for equal numbers of people, and that is the fundamental goal of the House of Representatives. So what happened then, based upon this 1964 Westbury Sanders case and cases that happened throughout the 60s and even on into the 70s and early 80s, is they continued to refine the definition of equality from, say, several percentage points of disparity down to fractions of 1%. So that within a state, as it relates to federal congressional districts, that within a state, they were within a fraction of 1% disparate from one to another, essentially equal. So we, therefore, in this lawsuit, and as I described in a previous video, the current disparity in the United States House from largest to smallest district is over 80%. How can we tolerate such massive inequity when back in '64 they were quoting the Constitution, going back to the original meaning of it and saying that we ought to have equal representation for equal numbers of people? We're merely applying that same standard across the country. And your federal government says, we don't have to abide by this equal standard of one person, one vote, which is, by the way, the phrase that came out of Westbury primarily: one person, one vote, equality. But you know what the federal government says? They says, well, you know what, that only applies to districts within a state. In fact, they even in their briefs defined the first sentence of Article 1, Section 2, that it only applies intra-state or within a state. When in fact you can see from the whole fabric of Article 1, Section 2, going back to the Constitutional Convention, looking at the Federalist Papers, you see that it was a holistic view that representatives ought to be apportioned according to population, whether it's within a state like Georgia or Mississippi or Utah versus across the country. Because should a voter in county or district A versus B in Georgia that is being disenfranchised when comparing the two of them, is that any different than comparing a voter from Mississippi to a voter in Wyoming? Don't they both feed representation that goes to the same national legislative body, which is our House of Representatives? So they ought to be equal. As equal, and here's the key, and we'll have to talk about this in future videos, the key is to make sure that they are as equal as is practicable. So this word practicable basically means that is it feasible? It's not to say that it has to be as equal as possible, because then we'd have to grow the House to its maximum size of 9,000 or 10,000 representatives. That would be as equal as possible, because it is constitutionally possible to have a House that large. But the lawsuit that we filed and other analyses would suggest that you can actually get to a disparity of less than 10% by having a House that's comprised of about 1,700 or 1,800 representatives. Now, that's not for this lawsuit, it's not for these plaintiffs, and it's frankly not even for the court to say what's appropriate. In fact, this lawsuit asks that 435, which is what's causing all of this inequity, that the number of 435 House of Representatives declared unconstitutional, and then send this case back to Congress, the very body that comes up with the number anyway. And they then have to go through whatever analysis they are, justify whatever inequity that they think is appropriate, and get down to district sizes that are as equal as is practicable. Because right now, I think whether you're Democrat, Republican, Independent, one thing we all can agree on, even though we may disagree on a lot of philosophical or political or other topics, one thing we all ought to agree on is that every American ought to deserve an equal voice and equal representation, just like these people back in the 60s, which is almost 50 years ago. But yet we still have inequity today, and this lawsuit and apportionment.us is fighting for equality and appropriate representation in the U.S. House. So if you want to learn more, visit our website at apportionment.us.